All right, let's get started. First of all, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming to this event and spending your afternoon with us. I am Linda Marin. I lead the Santa Cruz chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. CCL is actually an international organization, although mostly in the United States, and we unabashedly focus on getting national legislation for putting a price on carbon. And later, you'll hear a little more about that during the roundtable discussion. The reason that we're all in this room today is because one of our members, Jim Faith, got inspired by a webinar that was produced by an Ann Arbor CCL chapter, and it was entitled, "A Carbon Price is Right, Harnessing the Market to Drive Down Carbon Emissions." And that's a YouTube that you can actually see at your leisure. And what came from that is extreme inspiration on Jim's part. He actually has now created 2 events, and this is the first, this film and roundtable. And the second event is a webinar that is an affiliated event with the Global Climate Action Summit that is happening next month in San Francisco, although this is a webinar, so it's non-local. And if you would like to also participate in that event, register for it. At this table, the CCL table is a sign-up sheet. And you can just give us your email address and we'll tell you how to do that, how to get connected to it. That webinar is also co-sponsored with Monterey Bay Regional Climate Action Compact, and I hope that you will check it out as well. Also on that table, you'll find materials, I'm hoping, eventually they will arrive, about the entire Global Climate Action Summit that goes on for a week starting September 8th. So, first and foremost, a huge thank you to Jim for putting this together. And yeah, that's well deserved. And then I want to also thank our sponsors, Altera Solar, who has a table over there, and Monterey Bay Community Power, in the person of Mark Adata, who's also one of our roundtable people, who has information right here. And then we are also indebted to the City of Santa Cruz in the inestimable person of Tiffany Wise West, who may not be here today, but who has given such great support. And also Renewable Energy Investment Forum in the person of Daniel Robin, who is our moderator. I also want to thank Santa Cruz Climate Action Network, who is at the table at the far back, has all kinds of really great information as well. All right, and final thanks go to Museum of Art and History, and especially to Claudia, who made sure that the room was just right for us. Okay, this event starts with the assumption that carbon dioxide is the primary global warming molecule that we'd all like to do something about to reverse or at least mitigate the disruption to our climate that we're already experiencing. So I'm not going to start by trying to convince you carbon dioxide is a problem. I think we may all believe that now. It is my hope that we'll all leave here a bit clearer and wiser about how we'd like to use our own personal energy to leave our planet healthy and livable for the remarkable biodiversity that it still supports. All right, let me introduce our moderator, and then we'll go from there. So, our moderator is Daniel Robin, and he clearly, and Daniel, he clearly inherited his mother's passion and commitment to right action for the environment and the deepest regard for nature herself. And that's what happens when your last name happens to be Robin, and when you've begun from early childhood hiking the Sierra Camp loops with your family. Now, Jim Faith sought to involve Daniel with this event when he saw a talk that Daniel had given at an event called Climate Reckoning in December 2017 at Harvard University. Daniel was explaining through examples the economic case for building local self-reliance, for eco-restoration, and for using natural cycles as the optimal path to climate change reversal. Daniel has served as an adjunct professor at MIIS's Fisher MBA program, as a clean tech business coach, an impact entrepreneur since 1996, and as an irrepressible facilitator of big and little conversations. He's a UCSC grad and resident of Santa Cruz since 1979, and it is my pleasure now to give you Daniel.
Thank you all for coming. Wow, wonderful turnout here on a sunny Sunday afternoon. We have 20 minutes less than planned, but one thing we will not shortchange are your questions. Very important. You're supposed to pass your cards to Mary or Tommy. Mary, Tommy, could you? There you both are. Thank you. And so by about 20 after 3 o'clock, plus or minus 5 minutes, and if it's 20 after and we haven't started taking your questions from cards, someone ask a question. When are we, okay, make a fuss, because we really want to have this become a conversation. Wow, we have a lot to cover today because the film was just the icebreaker. We have 3 experts in rather diverse but complementary areas. We're going to get into that in just a second. I wanted to first express also some gratitude for Lois and John, I guess, are both in the room. Have you met them? Where are they? Where'd they go? There's John, the host, and Lois is probably somewhere.
Lois is reparking her car.
Okay. And so I guess I should make an announcement about not parking for more than 2 consecutive hours at Trader Joe's, otherwise, woo. Otherwise, there's a lot of carbon involved in that towing, yes. Okay. So, one of the reasons this is a delightful but very challenging conversation, to quote John Muir from the High Sierra Camp days, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else. Makes it challenging to talk about it in any sort of logical, linear way. There's intense complexity in this topic. There's a little bit of science that we'll refer to, hopefully very, very light amount, so that it's maybe understandable to all of us, because the complexity in the science of this is mind-blowing. IPCC alone could be a conversation for months. We'd never run out of material. Okay. But for the sake of today's discussion, what is the purpose? What purpose did you have in mind? Shout it out. Why are you here?
Concern.
Concern.
Answers.
Looking for answers.
Time's running out.
Seems, yeah.
What can we do to help?
Exactly. What actions can we do? What's really going to make a difference?
How open are we to make the real changes necessary?
An existential threat.
A real threat.
A real threat, an existential threat, probably. Some species are already experiencing that threat. And can we make a difference? How much of a difference can we make, and how soon? Well, some of today's discussion is going to highlight and maybe even pinpoint, building on the film, building on some other strategies. We believe that we actually have found, or we're going to at least discuss the beginnings of 3 strategies that will help us accomplish the overall target, let's call it, of no more than 2 degrees Celsius increase. 1.5 would be better. And the reason for that number, anybody know? Why 2 degrees? How about 0? How about go the other way? But why 2 degrees? Anybody? IPCC has done tremendous amount of research. You should see the number of scientists that, and the complexity of that analysis. It's very impressive. Is it right? Well, whatever. We don't know. But it's pretty well defended. And there's a reference to that. And by the way, if anybody wants a copy of these slides, can make them available or put them online and send you the link. Okay, the good thing about science, though, is it's true whether or not you believe in it. There's an irony for you. I believe that's after a flood. You can't quite tell that's water. one of the important themes, as you may have noticed, is water. It's pervading almost every aspect of this conversation, and so it should. Has a lot to do with healthy soil, has a lot to do with life-sustaining capacity. It's a water planet, as they say. Okay, and here's the 2%, 1.5%. I'm not going to expect any, there won't be a quiz, okay? But you see on the far right, it does say least cost would be the 2 degrees centigrade increase scenario. 1.5 would be better. Here's an easier way to hold on to it. I'm not sure this is the best metaphor, but a bathtub, we're already at, as of earlier this month, about 407 parts per million CO2. We're already at 407. We'd like to get down below 350. Who picked 350? Who says that's the right answer? Okay, and so part of what happens here is naturally counterbalancing the emissions, that some of which are natural, and certainly a lot of them, in most scientific opinions, are human-made, anthropomorphic, or whatever the word. But natural systems drain or remove carbon naturally in soil, for example, biological processes, but not fast enough to keep up with that tap that's just flowing and doesn't seem to be slowing down significantly. Today's panel will answer part of this question on how will we hold to no more than 2-degree increase. And this is, at least for today, our answer to that question, or the beginning of a bunch more questions. 3 things in this 3-legged stool. Any one of them, the thing falls over. It doesn't work. Everybody loses. Carbon pricing, emissions reduction, and then drawing down carbon, removing carbon from the atmosphere. And probably, I don't know, anybody here think geoengineering is a great idea? Oh, good. We won't have that debate. Nonetheless,
Necessary.
yeah, we don't need to. Yeah, they had a UCSC conference on the subject. They talked for a whole day, and then they concluded, no. I said, well, why'd you talk about it? Talk about something more important. Drawdown is a countervailing force to the emissions that's going on. And okay, here, cleverly enough, we have 3 panelists addressing these 3 legs. On the middle is Max, Dr. Max Henrian, improving policy frameworks for carbon pricing. To my immediate left, Mark Dato, talking about carbon emissions, addressing some of the risks of unabated carbon emissions, what can be done about carbon emissions. And of course, Sally, who you'll recognize from the film, but interestingly, live, her speaking matches. It's amazing how we had to pay a lot of money to get that synced up, I'm telling you. Food systems and regenerative agriculture, I don't know, probably not quite the right title, but close enough, yeah. And, you know, maybe this is the more apt metaphor, a 3-legged race. You've seen this, right? Well, because we are, in fact, somewhat joined at the something. We are interdependent, bordering on symbiotic with our natural environment. And hilarious video. These 2, one of them goes out first, the other one doesn't get the program, did not receive the memo. I don't know if it's sad or funny, it's both. All right, so here is our format. The idea is each of my esteemed panelists will make a 5-minute opening statement, opening remarks. Then we'll go into a round of questions addressing what they've said and more. Because these are 3 rather contrasting stories. In fact, they're complementary and they're very different, these 3 legs. We'll take a shot at finding the interrelations and integrations and conclusions in order to make it actionable. In order for it to make sense, coherence, sensibility, do something about it. There's already a lot being done. You can vote with your dollars. You can vote literally. There's a lot to do at the legislative level and elsewhere. And then we'll end by 4 o'clock, the last 5 to 8 minutes, I'm going to guess, where we're going to attempt to draw out conclusions, next steps, in fact, and closing remarks. Anybody come here for something different? Okay. How many are a little bit discouraged at this time, or maybe more than a little bit? Show of hands about the state of, yeah, okay, well, and how many think that there's no problem whatsoever? You're not in the room, okay. Well, you have come to the right place. Here's another version of our panelists, okay. All right. Birds of a feather. I had to do that because I knew Linda was going to make fun of my last name. Those are parrots. Okay. Our first presenter, doing his opening remarks, Dr. Max, may I call you Dr. Max?
Max by itself is fine.
Okay. Max is, by any other name, Max is a decision scientist. It's a policy analyst, around energy and the environment. Max builds computer models to provide support for such subtle, very easily managed kind of over breakfast questions as how rapidly can we decarbonize the US automobile fleet? No problem, right? Pour another bowl and think about that. Or call Max. The California Air Resources Board uses his company's software, for example, for evaluating different levels of carbon reduction in California. Max has been a neutral policy analyst for quite a while, and so therefore was quite pleased to join CCL local chapter and further its contributions. It's a pleasure, he was saying, to be in a conversation with people who live and work here in Santa Cruz, as does he. So, Max, on the theme of my earlier question, is there anything to be hopeful about?
Okay.
I need to...
So, does
yeah, I
do
gotta...
we have a clicker? Thanks so much for the introduction. And as Daniel was saying, I'm kind of particularly delighted. Usually, I'm addressing a bunch of sort of fellow geeks and modelers, and you know, in the last somehow since last November 2016, I kind of decided, okay, I need to, you know, get into a different kind of gear here. This concept of being the neutral analyst was always kind of a facade anyway, but now actually getting involved in trying to be an advocate seems like what we need to be doing. And I kind of said tipping points from despair to practical action. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by tipping points. Well, I think you probably already know. One of the things I wanted to say about the film that we just saw is how wonderful it is to be exploring the complexities of all these complex systems, all the carbon cycle, the water cycle, as it happens on the ground and the water around here. And that's kind of my theme, is complex systems. And complex systems have tipping points. And on the despair end, you know, I'm sure you're going to read this abstract right away. This is a paper that was just published a month ago by a bunch of top climate scientists about trajectories of the Earth system in the Anthropocene. And many of you may know the geological epoch that we're in is known as the Holocene, and it's been suggested we are entering a new epoch we should call the Anthropocene, meaning human affected, created, hopefully not destroyed epoch that we are now entering. And here's a nice graph. The thing that some of you might have actually heard about this report in the news, perhaps, this idea of hothouse Earth, that if we're not careful, we might be approaching a threshold in which it will be really hard to come back from, in which the Earth starts to, as it's starting in some ways, to the positive feedback cycles that make it hard to bring us back from continually increasing temperature. You know, one example that I expect most of you are familiar with is as ice starts to melt in the polar regions and in glaciers, the Earth is darker than the ice, and the sea is darker than the ice. It absorbs more solar energy, it warms up more, it melts more. Positive feedback cycle. You know, another, you know, particularly scary one that some of you might have heard of is there's a lot of methane locked up in sort of frozen in the tundra in parts of it. If that starts to be released into the atmosphere, methane is about 20 times the global warming potential per molecule than carbon dioxide. Again, a positive cycle. And these things are all various potential, what they call climate cascades. You know, as things start to go wrong, they start to go wrong even faster and support each other. Okay, so that's kind of the the despair slide, if you like. And the paper concludes the Earth system might be approaching a threshold, lock into a rapid pathway to hothouse Earth. And strangely enough, the media reports on this kind of mostly ignored the second part of what they said, which is, to achieve a stabilized Earth, and they actually show, an alternative pathway where we can still stabilize it. We require some fundamental restructuring of our institutions and organizations. And what I would point out here is, there are tipping points in the physical systems involved in climate. There are also tipping points in our social, organizational, national, local, international organizations. And we should be looking for those and figuring out things that we might do. Those are the points of leverage where we can change things surprisingly rapidly in some cases. And one case that I'm sure many of you are aware of is the adoption of wind and solar and electric vehicles. So initially it was kind of expensive, like, is this really going to save the world? Well, as people buy more of them, the prices come down, and so people are buying more of them. And now solar and wind in many places, including around here, are really cheaper than the fossil alternatives. So, even without government policy. And electric vehicles may be there or will be there shortly. And, right now you look at 1 million electric vehicles were sold in the world last year. It doesn't seem like that's really going to have a big impact. But once they start to become not just, faster, easier, lower maintenance, they will, suddenly it'll take off, and suddenly everybody will be buying them. Not even the people like us, just for environmental reasons, just because it's cheaper and better. And, the Paris Climate Accord, I'll explain why I think that. Rising support to price carbon, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. And, a tipping point that I see, and I think many of you that are in environmental organizations have seen this, there's been this sudden massive growth in membership, even people like me joining CCL. Why is that? Well, I think we know one of the reasons. And so there's this curious, when you look at things in a systems point of view, even apparently horrific negative things like we see in Washington right now, can have these curious positive consequences. And I think President Trump accused Obama, among other things, of being a community organizer. Actually, it turns out that, Trump is the most effective community organizer many of us have seen.
You know it, yes.
So thank you.
Thank you. Well done. Our next presenter for the opening remarks will be Mark. And Mark has a very unusual personal odyssey as part of his story, as well as a professional existence that integrates quite a remarkable set of previous experiences. I was intrigued to note some of the things that you had been doing before. Speaking of community organizing, you also have had time and planning for both cities and as well regional planning, residential finance, and also as a social entrepreneur. And by the way, none of this information has been fact-checked. If you want to do that on your own, I promise from at least my lips there will be no false anything. 1%, because I'll get it wrong. I'll make them. You got to figure out what 1% that is. Marx works with. By the way, show of hands. How many people have by now heard of MBCP, Monterey Bay Community Power? All right. How many of you are customers? All of them. Okay.
How many are Prime customers?
Ooh. Gold Star. And do you all know what a community choice aggregation is then? You've heard of CCA's, Community Choice Energy, which is what MBCP is? Yeah, pretty much. Not sort of. Really? Maybe? Okay. All right. Well, Mark's going to fill you in on that and as well explain a little bit of how you came to Monterey.
Okay, great. I'm going to step up to the podium here.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Sure.
Give you a quick introduction. So, Mark Adotto, Outreach Coordinator for Monterey Bay Community Power. Been in the environmental field ever since I graduated from UCSC. That was back in, I don't even want to say, 86, 7. Anyway, besides the local government work, the social entrepreneurship, what is it that led me into putting my life, energy, time, and passion into this community choice energy model? And it was really no small wonder that in 2008, June 10th to be exact, I was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Very, very rare disease for somebody my age. I was extremely healthy. And so this kind of came out of the blue. And it was the most harrowing experience, that I went to. It's not unusual. Some people sail through, some people don't. But it was, the most incredible chemotherapy you can imagine. Full body fractured radiation, 7 lumbar punctures, multiple bone marrow biopsies. No fun there. Anyway, to make it through all of that is it's just beyond a miracle that I'm even here. Absolutely a miracle. So I won't belabor the ordeal, but I will say that we found a donor, and this was through Be the Match. Was 1 in 11 million in the nick of time. Yoav Yona from Israel, he wasn't a match for the young boy in his town, but he was a match for me. And so forever grateful. And so my experience through this whole bone marrow transplant, a 3-year recovery, learning how to walk again twice. I like that putting on pounds in middle life, because there was a time I was Skeletor man, not a pretty sight. And so the commonalities of my personal journey really relate to everything that we're talking about here now. You had to have resiliency, the ability to have adaptation, building awareness and transparency. I mean, you are completely, utterly exposed in the transplant process. Yahweh on the cross kind of, vulnerability. The fact that 1 in 11 million, talk about a small planet, that's why I brought the blue marble there, that's a nice lapis piece, just to remind us how fragile this planet is that we're on. Ultimately, it's a soul journey that we're on. So for everybody that is in fear, you can really relax, because life continues on. I know that from my near-death experience. So with that, there was a choice point. Either live or die. You got to figure it out. And there is definitely divine intervention, because there was something that was carrying me through this at one point when I had absolutely nothing left. So miracles happen. Hold on to that one. Miracles happen. The ability to rebuild from a scorched earth kind of protocol, barbaric protocol, is something that we can take with us as we want to repatriate and renew the earth, as we've been talking about so far today. It required a need to change everything, and I think that's something that we're all very anxious as how can I help bring on this new paradigm of changing everything. Definitely an existential threat to survival. We're feeling that on a planetary scale now. Big midlife wake-up call. Who am I? Where do I come from? Why am I here? Where do I go? And the epiphany out of the near-death experience, and I wrote this on a napkin after 5 weeks of not drinking anything, not eating anything, and not sleeping for over a month. And it was a triangle with love, intention, everything's connected. That was the epiphany. That was the knowing, right? Once you know something, you can't unknow it. And then on the edge of each corner of the triangle, I put the environmental crisis, because that's where I've been coming from, what I've been working on, quantum physics, and consciousness. These are the pieces that need to come together. And that led into many years of study during my recovery, which was the fortunate part of this whole thing. I won't belabor that. So many things that I think we can all relate to in terms of this conversation about sequestering carbon, moving towards sustainability, economic and social justice, etc. So that's the lead-in, if you will, for just a quick, what is Monterey Bay Community Power? Because when I regained my health, I got back on the board at Ecology Action. We had a statewide grant for $33 million. That was during a TARP, the ARA funds that came through. We took energy efficiency statewide, and it was after 2012 when Jenny Johnson, who was really the champion for this, that we began to go around to the local cities and the counties and get resolutions of support, get a CEC grant for close to $250,000 to do the technical feasibility study, and move this forward as a project that has come to fruition. So with that, 16 cities, 3 counties. This is the first one to come on board as 3 counties at one time. We've got 2 boards, a policy board, that's our electeds. We've got an operations board, that's our executive city management, 11 members each. Every city of 50,000 has 1 vote, and then the others share a seat. You've got the main joint power authority goals. This is similar to how you would set up a water district, a waste management district, a transportation regional agency. Our goals are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, provide competitive and stable rates, increase energy efficiency, and create local jobs in the process while we take control over our energy resources, electricity. Quick look at the org chart. You can see we've got a community advisory council, which I'll touch on, as well as oversight for purchasing our energy. About 18 staffers, and then fortunate to have Tom Habashi, 30 years in energy buying and management, as our CEO. So this community advisory council, this is where all of us get to plug in. Yes, you can come to the boards, but this has really been designed to bring in the community input as to the projects, the programs, and how we're going to spend our net revenue in our Tri-County area. 11 members recruited out of, 60 candidates, and they're going to have purview over everything. They're going to decide, but my guess is it's going to be rates, procurement, and programs, and they're going to have their second meeting third Thursday of this month. So open to everybody. I encourage you to show up. So quick look at the Western grid. You can see a bunch of various energies coming onto the grid. On the left, fossil fuels, nuclear to renewable, and a bunch of buyers on the other side, of which community choice aggregators are one of them. And what CCAs do is they allow you to purchase the electricity, clean up your portfolio, and keep the profits local. I say we, our local city and county agencies that form the Joint Powers Authority. So we're moving and accelerating the renewable energy development model. This is why CCAs are moving so quickly around the state. The model is a hybrid model. So in that sense, we're relying on the grid, we're relying on the investor-owned utilities to continue to provide transmission, distribution, customer billing, read the meters, maintain all the infrastructure. And the piece that CCAs have pulled out of this is just the electric generation portion of it. So it's a partnership, if you will. Sometimes contentious, but a partnership nonetheless. Enrollment, as you know by now, is automatic. No action is required, and it is accelerating. We launched our commercial in March. We were 12th in the state. Now there are 19 as of this week, and we'll probably have 50% of all customers sourcing electricity out of this community choice energy model by 2020. So it's moving here. It's moving in other states, Ohio, Illinois, Massachusetts. So the reasons for this are the benefits that we derive as a community, this local control. Now, I bring up this California Independent System Operator. That's the balancing agency that gets real-time demand and supply to correlate on a quarter-hour basis. No small feat for a state like California. And so what you can see with this duck curve is that essentially there's been so much renewable energy that has been brought on and incentivized into the market in the last, say, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, that you've got an abundance of renewable energy that is filling this middle-of-the-day demand. And really what's missing now is we don't have the storage component so that we can take all that renewable energy and then be able to use it during the off-peak. And so what this is causing, year by year, as more renewable energy has come onto the scene, you basically have this ramping up and ramping down of fossil fuels to basically meet the demand. So we're moving into storage and a lot of other good things on the project side, which I won't go into now. Power content for PG&E is carbon-free of about 69%, and we've got 100% carbon-free energy for all of our customers at a rate savings. So I guess I'll stop there. Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes.
That's fine. And our third panelist, you've at least seen, not totally in sync, but you've heard Sally's comments from the film. And it's a couple of surprising facts. With a last name like Calhoun, good old OK Corral, guess what? She's not into horses. Who would have thought? Actually, Sally likes to play tennis. But I guess that means no polo on your grounds, right?
They
no.
used to, but we don't.
Oh, okay. Too many plants now, right? Yeah, everything's green and okay. It's interesting to note that Sally's Piscinas Ranch is within MBCP's district. It's San Benito County. About how many miles north of Pinnacles National Park are you?
22.
22. And that it has been a working ranch since the mid-1880s. And you also founded the No Regrets Initiative, which I hope you're going to comment on when you are able to share with us kind of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And can we really make a difference? Thank you, Sam.
Right, sure. You want to hand me the little juice? I won't show you too many pictures or say too much about what we're doing because you got a good introduction in the movie. So I'll try to go quickly. These are the kind of pictures you've seen. This is our vineyard site at high density grazing. Those are our sheep, our grazier, Jess, our guard dogs. So we raise beef, cattle, grapes, a variety of grains, peas, and are working on a lot of other crops that we'll probably be raising. So you've heard a lot about the work that we're doing on the ranch, so we'll talk a little bit about what else we're doing. The No Regrets Initiative is really a name that we gave to the body of our work, which is around restoring the agricultural soils of North America. And we do that by doing it in Piscinas and learning everything we can. We do a lot of convening and workshops for practitioners all over the country who are working on the same issues. We invest in for-profit social enterprises, mostly farmers and ranchers who are on the leading edge of regenerative agriculture. And we also make a lot of philanthropic grants in the space of regenerative agriculture. And that whole umbrella we call the No Regrets Initiative. The name comes from the fact that soil carbon sequestration, or drawdown into the soil, is referred to as a no regrets negative emissions technology. So a negative emissions technology is something that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it somewhere where it's not causing climate change. And the reason soil is called the no regrets is that if there is no climate change, say that we're all wrong and we should stop worrying about climate change, it would still be really, really important to regenerate the Earth's soils. Because by doing that, we would get better water quality, less flooding, better resistance to drought, more nutritious food, and then we would have world peace. So even yes. So the United Nations estimates that we have 60 years of topsoil left. So even if there is no climate change, this is the most important thing to do in the world. The other reason it's called that is because when my grandchildren look at me and go, "What the were you thinking?" I can say I did everything I could think of. I pulled out every stop, and that's why I'm spending 25 years of my life working on this problem. And I will answer only one more thing I wanted to say. Nope, wrong way. Oh, that's it. Okay, all right. Well, I'll just answer the next question. I don't see the slide. The question I wanted to answer is just, can this be big enough to matter, right? Can we really use a bunch of green plants and pull enough carbon out of the atmosphere to make a difference in climate change? And I think you saw the slide in the movie. Rattan Lal at Ohio State says that if we increase soil organic matter by about 2% worldwide, we can make a significant difference. That's actually a pretty conservative number, I think. One thing people don't realize, a lot of the extra carbon in the soil, in the air, actually came out of the soil. Since we invented the plow, we've been taking carbon out of the soil. Most agricultural soils have lost 40, 50, 60% of the carbon that was there. So part of it is really to use photosynthesis and plants and put the carbon back where it's supposed to be, and it can make a big difference in both mitigating and even reversing climate change if we don't hit any of those darn tipping points first.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, thank you. And let's see. You may be heartened to know there is currently an IPCC special report that is in the works. And it supports a lot of what's been said and explains in rather great detail, including a few chapters I've pulled out just to highlight what the soil's potential is for really making a difference. With over 100 scientists in 52 countries, first draft is out. Final draft next September. Not this month, next month, next year. It's cleverly enough called the special report CCL, Climate Change and Land. You'll be able to remember that acronym, I'm sure. CCL, the special report from CCL, and there's information on the website about it. Now we're going to jump into just one round of questions directed at each of our panelists because we want to get to your questions and we won't have time for two. But it'll work, he says, bravely. Convincing himself as he's saying it. Okay, we're just going to jump right on this then. First question's to Max. Max, why should we put a price on carbon? And what's the best way to start?
Well, let's see. So, a lot of the problem we have is too much carbon in the atmosphere. It's not the only one. There are other greenhouse gases. And we have heard about, a variety of things that we can do to reduce our carbon emissions. But, I think a price is a nice, simple way to do it. So every time we drive our car running on gasoline, we turn on electric, most of us, generating carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that is imposing a cost on the whole globe in terms of climate change. And, economists say that's an externality. That is to say, we're imposing this cost on everybody, but we don't experience anything ourselves aside from our little share. So we should bring that internal. So when we make a decision to generate carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, or alternatively, a decision like Sally's doing, to absorb carbon dioxide into the ground or into trees, there should be a dollar price on that. Sally should be getting some value, be paid for that additional service she's providing the world. And the rest of us that are generating carbon should pay that extra cost. So we're not saying, okay, everybody has to go cold turkey, no more carbon fuels. I don't think that's going to work, even here. But we should know what the real price of it is. And so a price on carbon is a way to do that.
Beautiful. And you should know that on September 11th, there will be a webinar, an affiliated event to today's event. There's more information about that online, and you certainly probably heard about it if you have not. Check it out. September 11th, Max, and how many other panelists, Jim?
Tiffany Wise-West.
Tiffany Wise-West, the Sustainability Manager for the city.
Caitlin from EDF, the Senior Policy Analyst for the Climate Group at Environmental Defense Fund.
We're going to go way deep into this exact subject. Okay, get into the details. Just an important question, Max, since California is a little bit progressive. Can I use that word? Is there a potential...
Ahead of the curve?
Yeah, ahead of the curve. Leading the country, probably, in some areas anyway, including stopping things, not just starting things. But is there a potential at the national level for carbon pricing? What are your thoughts?
See, do I get any slides here? Or? I don't need them, but...
Do you want them?
Sure, if they're easily available. So I mean, that kind of seems like a hard question right now. You look at Washington, that doesn't seem to be where leadership is coming out right now on climate questions. And, I've been going to Washington over my life, doing work for the Department of Energy and EPA and off and on. But I've always stayed well away from the Capitol building and the politicians. And so I decided to become a lobbyist. I know that doesn't sound that great to many of you, being part of the swamp here, okay? So just to say, well, worldwide, putting a price on carbon is happening in many, many places. And, California is ahead of the curve in the U.S. Northeast states are also involved in it. There's carbon trade, carbon pricing. China is introducing a cap and trade scheme, actually somewhat modeled on California. They came to look at ours. Obviously, that's pretty huge. Here's the U.S. states. 22 states have essentially said they're going to continue with the Paris Accord no matter what Washington says, and 274 cities in the U.S. So not all despair here. One of the things I want to say briefly about putting a price, which is kind of important, which is, yes, let's say we should all be paying $20 or $40 a ton on CO2. That's not actually doesn't turn out to be a huge amount personally, but it's still not trivial. And low-income households pay a larger fraction of their lesser income on energy and essentially carbon. So putting up the price of energy and other carbon hits lower incomes worse. Even though higher income people have a higher carbon footprint, it's a less percentage. So the idea is that the money that we raise from putting a carbon tax, or we might prefer to call it a carbon fee, is all that money is not kept by the government, but it is handed out to all of us, an equal amount to each person in most of the proposals. So that's why it's not a tax. It's kind of revenue neutral. And that's also why a lot of conservatives can get on board with this and are on board with this policy, as well as us folks here. Well, there might be some conservatives here. I don't want to prejudge anything. And okay, this slide was like, how many of you know that at least when you were still getting money from PG&E, that you got a carbon credit on your bill? Okay, they haven't done a very good job of advertising it, but this is a tiny little way in which the money that gets paid for carbon emission permits essentially gets redistributed to the rest of us. But most of it doesn't. And so I'm not going to go with this detail. Just to say, the point of if you have a equal dividend to each person, might come out to an average of about a little over $800 a year, starting out at, well, this is at $40 a ton. So not an insignificant amount, but it goes to each family, each household, I should say. So the lower income households get a net dividend. They come out ahead from this, from where they are today, and the higher income households are paying more money. So to me, this is kind of important because actually I care, as you might guess, a lot about climate change, but I'm just as concerned about inequality and what that's doing to our society. And so this is a way in which a fee and dividend process addresses both those, not in a complete way, but as a starting point. And so this is me as a lobbyist in DC with about 1,200 fellow lobbyists from CCL, and they organize us to go and see each of our representatives and other people. How many of you, is Anna Eshu your representative? Okay, so here we are, several people in this room, Linda and many others, meeting with Anna Eshu, who I'd been voting for years, and it was like, didn't know anything about her, and now I feel like, oh, great, she's actually a pretty cool lady. I'm really glad to be voting for her, has very well-informed, strong opinions about climate change. And how many of you are in Jimmy Panetta's district? Okay. So we also went to meet with him. Obviously, he's a strong environmentalist. He's not on board with the dividend yet, but we're working on that because we see that as an important social justice issue, especially for all the farm workers and farmers in his district. And they also have been instrumental in creating this Congressional Climate Caucus, which is an equal number of Congress people from the Democrats and the Republicans. And when Trump took over in 2017, it had just 12 members. And today, this is all the members. So this is kind of another exponential process, a kind of tipping process I like to see. And that's already enough Republicans that if they vote with all the Democrats, it would create a climate policy. Maybe not this year, but soon.
Perfect. Thank you, Max. Okay, and now we're going to come back to local. And thank you for bringing up the social justice aspect. It's a fact that electricity still isn't affordable for so many people in our local communities, especially here in the Tri-County area. We have an issue, and having endured many of the board meetings of NBCP, I know that they actually thought about that quite a bit. Mark, could you explain a little bit to us about how less well-off or lower-income folks are going to be accommodated in the current programs?
So one of the JPA goals, as shown before, was to stabilize and lower rates for customers. And built into the service offerings that we have, we call it MB Choice. That's the base service that everybody gets when they're automatically enrolled in the Monterey Bay Community Power. So that's carbon-free, renewable energy at a 3% rate savings. And then we've got two other programs that allow people to essentially take that 3% rate savings and put it to environmental works locally or into social equity bucket, if you will. And so that's the MB Green Plus or MB Share. And this MB Share is really designed, as you were stating, to think about this ahead of time as something that would be nested into the community foundations that we as Monterey Bay Community Power would also contribute more money to. So the idea was to have folks that wanted to contribute receive a little bit of a tax deduction for doing so, and then that would go to further help stabilize rates for lower income ratepayers and also move into being able to deliver projects and programs that would particularly benefit the underrepresented communities. One of the things we're looking at is working with grid alternatives, which is putting solar onto multifamily res and apartments, and in doing so, building into that a workforce training program. So that's one idea. The other idea that we're looking at is perhaps how can we incentivize this EV technology uptake in the used EV market? Can we put some incentives out there to help get these used EVs, which are obviously at a cost savings for people that are spending a lot of money on gas, it's a big portion of your monthly budget, into those kind of communities, neighborhoods, etc. We're looking at funding a zero-interest electric bike program to help folks that need transportation and are using transit to have better accessibility in our community. So there are a bunch of things that we're looking at to really address programs that drive into that apartment, multifamily community that have hereto been difficult to make happen. And so we've got some funds to do that. We've got some partners to do that. I was mentioning before that we've got, it looks like a $3 million grant coming from the CEC to basically put a bunch more charging stations out there for EVs to get this EV transportation, basically electrify the transportation sector. And we can bring some money to the table to do that, as can our regional air district. So there's a collaboration where we have potentially, $5 million that we can invest to help move these charging stations into areas that typically don't get that kind of infrastructure. So,
thank you very much. Good job, Mark. And since time seems to be evaporating faster than water off of bare dirt, I'm going to throw a question to you, Sally. Something I actually have been wondering about, and I'm going to see a show of hands real quick. How many of you, prior to today, seeing the film about it, hearing from Sally and the other panelists, how many of you knew that you could sequester massive amounts of carbon in soil through the practices that they're, how many knew? And to how many of you is it news or partial news? Oh, about half and half. Okay, so here's the question. Since you folks are ostensibly the converted already, Sally, how come more people don't already know about this? Why haven't I heard about it before?
Well, a lot of the reason, frankly, is because a lot of the science surrounding it is quite new. It's really hard to study what happens in the biological community in soil. There are more soil organisms in a cup of soil than there are human beings on the planet. And what they do is very hard to figure out. How they interact with each other is very hard to figure out, and it's hard to study outside of this living system, which is the soil. So the science is evolving rapidly on this. And my snarky, cynical answer is that the people who control agricultural research today are the large chemical companies that dominate agriculture, and they are working on biological solutions, but there has not been a lot of interest in pursuing this biological solution that really hopefully enriches the land stewards and their communities as opposed to the large agrochemical companies. So, but there are a lot of very fair reasons. It's just pretty new, and the potential around it is really becoming understood.
Very good. Okay, thank you. And along that same line, how many regenitarians are there in the room? Anybody know what a regenitarian? All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 5. Anybody know what a regenitarian? You want to take a guess? Vegetarian that eats meat, grass-fed beef, specifically, because of the environmental benefit, the carbon sequestration potential. Who knew, huh? The premiere of The Dirt on Climate Change, we had a few convertees in the room. So a couple people who stood and testified, I'm going to start eating meat now because, okay, not everyone, not for everyone. Certainly Richard in his garden is a committed vegan. He's not converting anytime soon. It may seem a little counterintuitive, but I know this is the difficult question, and maybe it's a short, brief answer if you would care to weigh in on, wait a minute, I thought cows were the problem. Aren't they the problem? How could they possibly be part of the solution?
A quick answer is that 60 to 70% of the Earth's surface that's not water is grasslands, and that's what grows there. It's just it relates to the soils and the weather, and these grasslands evolved with large herds of ruminants. And the reality is we've killed most of those ruminants, and if there are no animals on grasslands, they degrade and they turn into desert. So, sure, it's kind of a first world solution to say I'll be a vegan. Many of the people in the world have to rely on grazing ruminants, and in order to have healthy ecosystems, we have to manage those grazing ruminants, but they have to be there. We can't just walk off now after killing the animals that sustained those grasslands. And we could talk about CAFOs and methane and all those things in gory detail, but that's not a short answer.
Protozoa, nematodes, and fungi are neither, so we'll stay away from the science on that for the moment. But thank you for that, and that's very helpful. Is no-till the answer?
So one of the principles of regenerative agriculture is to minimize tillage. So you minimize this disturbance. The disturbance is very catastrophic for soil biology. Imagine tilling is kind of like you had New York City and you took this giant rototiller and you went right down the middle of the road, right? You tear everything up. So tillage is very disturbing. No-till has done a good job of stopping erosion, but no-till is currently practiced. It relies on many, many tons of herbicides, which are also not great for soil biology. So no-till is an improvement over a lot of current agricultural practices, and reducing tillage dramatically is part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. I think the key thing here is in ag, it's not like you just change one thing and you solve the problem. Not only are the whole systems interconnected, but the practices are interconnected and synergistic. And it's hard to simplify to the magic bullet that people want. If we just stop tilling and keep spraying, it's not going to do it. And you can look at the soil carbon numbers. They do not come up very quickly in the no-till system. It's very, very slow. That will not get us where we need to be.
Yeah, that complexity again. There we go. Many, many facets. And now we're going to start to, and I said it and I meant it. It is 20 after, 22 after. We're going to now, please, pass in any remaining questions to Mary, Tommy, get them to Linda. And we're going to go through now and take the rest of our time to address some of your questions. And in particular, I'd like you and the panel, as much as we possibly can, to focus on action steps, things you could do. I heard one from our previous discussion for any regenitarians who are already doing it. Buy grass-fed, buy pasture-raised. If you're going to buy meat at all, make sure it is, right? Grass-fed butter probably is healthier. Some people have been trying to convince me of that for a long time. All right, and so I'm afraid we have no further time for planned questions, boo, but we now have your questions, and these are probably more interesting anyway. Anyone, please, what is the year by which we need to begin to bend the carbon curve down before climate change is irreversible?
Yesterday.
Yes,
Today.
Now would
Now
be good. Max, do you have an...
I don't know if there's a well-defined, I mean, obviously, now would be a good time.
Yeah, we have less catching up.
And it seemed like it was last year, apparently. We're coming down this year, it's going up a little bit, but, you know. But I wouldn't say there's like one single time that is the last possible moment.
Yeah, the bathtub will not overflow. It'll just be more and more species will die off, and it'll be bigger and bigger problem, more displacement,
Getting harder and harder.
You know, moving in from the shores. However, that just makes it harder to reverse the trend. And the good news is, it is reversible. That the drawdown speed is quite within reason. What did you say, 2% of the soil? Somebody said.
Well, Rita Lau says if we could do that in the whole world, we could do that globally.
That's a lot of soil.
It's a lot of soil. It's a lot of work.
All right, I got
But 2% is
200,000 hectares in Ghana. Next, okay.
2% is also, we can do better than that in a lot of places, and we can do it relatively quickly where there's water. And the other thing that the IPCC tends to ignore is that we can actually create topsoil. So they think only about the top 12 inches of soil. There's a lot more potential probably because we know we're sequestering carbon down at 24 and 36 inches, and we know we can create soil pretty quickly, like in years, not in decades or centuries.
That is a longer conversation than we have time for today, I think, but it's it just means we get to work less hard if we take action already. If we work, yesterday and now in particular. This is the moment of choice. Now is the time for that kind of action. Here's an interesting question. I don't know if anyone on the panel feels comfortable talking about ethics, but the question is, are there any ethical, moral, intuitive guidelines that can guarantee our solutions will not just be better mousetraps, not just incremental improvements? Moral, ethical, or intuitive guidelines?
I could speak to that.
Please.
I think that one of the things that we're seeing, remember Naomi Klein came out with a book, a couple years ago. She came to town and previewed her film, and it was really calling attention to capitalism and the monetary system, basically the paradigm that is running us into the ground. And what was an aspect of that is that she was bringing in all of the people that are on the front lines that are being hardest hit by the kind of climate change that's happening globally, and these are the indigenous peoples around the world. And what they have the ability to do is to lean back on all of their legal framework around their treaties to essentially slow and reverse, sequester and preserve all of this natural habitat. It's a legal mechanism that she was speaking to. And what she was really calling to action from folks living in the first world is that we all need to help the indigenous peoples that are on the front lines with our time, with our advocacy, with our lobbying efforts, with whatever kind of contributions we can make. And that really comes down to the moral framework about how we're operating as a human species on planet Earth. So it's
There is one thing I might add to that, and I really appreciate what you're saying here, which is, we are, as a species, actually, not just us, but apes too, have a very strong sense of what's fair and what isn't fair. Even 3-year-olds have a powerful sense of that. And, that ultimately is what we need to drive us forward in this and many other things. And, I showed the Paris Climate Treaty, and I know a lot of people are a bit cynical about that, as kind of an indicator of forward movement. But as far as I know, that's the only time the world has come together, made voluntary commitments, each country defining their own commitment. And there's no teeth in it, there's no black helicopters coming in to enforce it. Most of the countries are following through in that commitment, as in fact this country is in many ways, despite Washington. So, that's not enough. It's, it maybe only get half of the way there if everybody followed their commitments. But that's pretty amazing. That's kind of something new for this world, for us to come together voluntarily without coercion and agree at that level. So, more of that.
Indeed. And I have a question, another one for you, Max, and then one for you and Sally. Max, a little challenge here on the point about carbon, putting a price on carbon. Doesn't selling carbon, that's what it says, get polluters off the hook because they can just buy their way out?
Well, they can buy their way out, but they have to pay for it. And, more and more and more, so most of them are going to well, is there some other way? Can we do this without burning fossil fuels, like you guys are doing? That's what we want. We want to give them the right incentives.
Yeah, penalties and incentives, and it's hitting them in the wallet. It's got to have some effect. If it hits them hard enough, it will change behavior. That's
and it's not just
effect.
them.
Right.
It's us.
That's true too. Thank you. Okay, one for you and Sally, I think, which is how much carbon impact is occurring with the Sierra tree die-off due to the drought and bark beetle and a host of other, mostly the drought. I suppose it's interactive with many issues and it's not quite that simple, but how much carbon impact is occurring?
Numbers you'll have to do. Obviously, it's more the fires, I think, from the dead trees that are the carbon impact, and it seems like it must be huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I actually can speak to that one a little bit because I'm in a business where taking otherwise dangerous, hazardous biomass and doing something constructive with it, rather than letting it. I mean, if the cycle of fires is helpful to the environment, and in some cases it is, depends on the fire and depends on where it is and how much it burns and so on. Okay, a lot of the fires we're seeing in California right now are not that, but there are quite a lot of fires that are part of cycles of nature and so on. Okay, if there's an area where you have a biomass excess and a big problem, if you can figure out a way to collect the biomass and convert it into something called biochar and energy, you're going to be ahead of the curve. And it's exactly what's been done and is being done today in southern Mediterranean countries, Spain and Portugal, where they were seeing wholesale fires just knocking everything down. So organize around that, and you'll have a profitable business. It solves a problem, and then that char actually is elemental carbon that can be used in agriculture and for a whole bunch of other things.
Could I add one more thing on that? So the other thing to think about is if we had a working water cycle, if we had healthy soils, fewer of those trees would die as a result of the drought. And I hope that this is a moment in California. Managed grazing on public lands at large scale can't fix the problem that exists today, probably because it's totally out of control. But I hope it starts a conversation around if we're going to spend $475 million a year fighting fires, maybe we could look at the cost of planned grazing to make our public landscapes healthier. The fact that cattle have been banned from many of these landscapes is contributing significantly to loss of ecosystem function and fires. And I really hope we start that conversation.
And Russ, are you here? Raise your hand. Yeah. So Rain for Climate is called? Yeah. 2 years ago in this very room, Russ was part of a panel where he presented alongside a bunch of other folks focused on permaculture, sustainable agriculture, and so on. Visit his website. There's a heck of a story from a Slovakian hydrologist that has now proved the model over and over and over again. And it's not that different than regenerative agriculture, but it has some key differences. The focus is a little different. It's on water. Now, water is always part of the inseparable equation of energy and food. You can't do one, it's another three-legged stool, right? Okay, check out either the science of it or the practicalities of rainforclimate.com. All right, I'm going to throw one over to you, Mark, if I may, changing the subject just a little bit. And then we're going to come back to, by the way, show of hands, how many people really just don't eat meat at all today and don't plan to eat it anytime soon? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Well, they're going to have that conversation at least a bit for the sake of 9 humans that asked a question, representative question here about that we're assuming. Let's get into it. Then I'll go to you, Mark, if I may. The discussion seems to assume the primacy of meat.
No.
According to a non-meat eating perspective, and the other 8 of you may agree, that the primacy of meat eating and cultivation. How would we change our agricultural practices to optimize carbon sequestration in a system that doesn't prioritize meat eating? What's the vegan perspective?
So, okay.
Sorry.
So just something to think about for a moment is that organic agriculture, the fertility in organic agriculture, which you guys probably all eat organic produce, doesn't allow synthetic fertilizers. The fertility for organic production comes from the manure of animals. Most of it comes right now from chickens raised in CAFOs. That chicken manure is turned into manure pellets, and that is what the big industrial organic ag guys use as fertility. So if you're going to outlaw synthetics like ammonium nitrate, and if you're not going to have any animals, it is probably possible. All plants on the planet have the capacity to synthesize nitrogen, and there's a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere. So it might be possible with fantastic cover crops and fantastic soil health to generate enough fertility to grow all of the food we need. But that is going to be super hard. It is not the way nature ever worked. There have been animals on the planet in this evolving system for forever. So I'm not saying it's not possible, but if you are vegan and you think that animals aren't involved in the production of your food, you need to learn how the food that you're eating is actually raised, because I bet you that almost all of your food involves animals. Not the death of animals, except that, of course, in CAFOs, those chickens are grown to make meat, or they're grown to make eggs and then are killed when they're not making eggs anymore. So I'm happy to have the vegan conversation at 4 o'clock with anyone who really wants to talk about it, because I think it's really important for us all to understand the whole system and not to look at just one piece of the system and think, I fixed that. So that's my only plea, is think about the whole thing and understand where your food comes from.
Thank you, Sally. Appreciate weighing in on that. There's a couple other on the subject of big ag. We'll come back to that in just a few minutes. And there's also the I'm going to call it the 7 or 8 billion pound gorilla or elephant in the living room about population. Oh boy. But for the moment, Mark, get something a little bit more addressable in this room, hopefully. Any legislative policies or requests from the large utilities to hinder the formation of CCEs? Yes. CCEs are being challenged all the time.
So this begs the legislative regulatory part of what we're doing on the policy side. And there are numerous pieces of legislation that are being tracked by, we have a staffer who's actually in Sacramento keeping track on all of the legislation that's being proposed. This is all coming out of the CPUC's Green Book. I think they've retitled it within the last week, but they basically did a survey around California. They've seen all the communities that are leaving to form their own CCE organizations, joint power authorities, and they came up with a bunch of recommendations. No surprise, these recommendations were favorable to the investor-owned utilities. So we knew months and months ago that this year was going to be an incredibly heavy legislative year. Anything that could be done to take this CE model, this community choice energy model, and make it less profitable, slow it down, is being activated, if you will. So the pushback is coming from CalCCA. That's the organization that we belong to. We pay significant dues to CalCCA to advocate on behalf of Monterey Bay Community Power and all the other CCAs all around the state. And then we've got what's happening at the California Public Utility Commission level on the regulatory side. So the key issues that we're struggling with, battling with, advocating for have to do with resource adequacy planning. And this is the issue that the investor-owned utilities are struggling with how is it that we provide all of the energy for our customers, including those customers that are leaving to form their own CCAs. Should they go belly up, we're still needing to provide resource adequacy energy for those customers that may come back to us. So there's this tension about how you go about planning to meet your energy load around the state of California as communities are taking control over what they're buying. And so that's a key issue. The other key issue that is, I'll say, not quite been decided, but it's been proposed, is this exit fee. And I was talking about this with somebody earlier. So this power charge and difference adjustment, it shows up on your PG&E bill. It's nested in PG&E's rates. With the CCE model, this exit fee, it represents the utilities being made, quote unquote, indifferent for the purchase of these energy contracts bought on all our behalf many, many years ago at much higher prices. So they're still on the hook to pay for those, even though we've left the fold and are buying cheaper energy, cleaner energy on the wholesale market on our own. So they call these stranded costs. So this exit fee or this power charge and difference adjustment represents about 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour on your electricity bill. In Monterey Bay Community Power, we actually break that out. So we're making that transparent. That's a good thing. But what is in contention is how do we negotiate and abrogate this stranded cost? And so some of the ideas that have been proposed are that we at least limit the investor-owned utilities to a window of time where this exit fee is going to be accounted for. So no contracts earlier than 2002, which is when CCA came on board as legislation, and nothing past 2010, which is when the Cal CCA feels the utilities should have seen what was coming down the pike and not been entering into more longer-term contracts. So a way to sort of shrink the cost down. There is some talk about the CCAs around the state of California forming some kind of a supra joint powers authority where they could basically bond out these hundreds of millions of dollars over 30 years and basically be done with this issue. The significance to our local area is that this power charge and difference adjustment, if they raise it, 0.27 cents a kilowatt hour, our net revenue is going to drop along with the lowering of PG&E's prices by about $10 million a year. So it's very significant in terms of local CCA. We'll still be viable. We'll still be able to deliver carbon-free energy to everybody, but it'll take us longer to essentially build reserves, get a bond rating, and accelerate the programs that we want to accelerate. So lots of advocacy being done around the state and plenty of organizations that you can plug into, Center for Climate Protection, Local Energy Aggregators Networks.us, good folks out there doing good work.
On the other side of the folks who have less capital to pay for the electric bill, say a little bit about 100% Monterey Bay Prime proposal, the one that's 100% renewable.
Yeah, so thank you. That was a great question. So of all the service offerings, the MB Choice is the product or service offering that everybody gets. Now what happened was that one of the big advocates for Monterey Bay Community Power was the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And so when we were moving to launch, they said, we really want to participate with Monterey Bay Community Power, but we don't like the fact that you're buying 70% carbon-free energy from large hydro, mostly from the Pacific Northwest. We're concerned about the oceans, hydrology, how the systems operate from the rain flow to the rivers out to the ocean, etc. So what can you do for us? And so within about a month, the two boards came up with a product, and this is not uncommon for what other CCAs are doing, where we're going to have the ability to purchase nothing but solar and wind, not even any small hydro, solar and wind out of California with some storage. And this is at a price premium of a penny more per kilowatt hour. So for those people that just want solar and wind, that's a service offering that we have. And PG&E has that product as well, but it's a little bit more expensive than our version. So that's MB Prime. It's same thing. You get a 3% rate savings, and you can also take that rate savings and move it over to the two do-good buckets, one for renewable energy, one for social equity.
Let's do a couple more quick ones, Mark, and then we'll come back to the topic of agriculture and probably take that right to the 4 o'clock hour. A couple quick ones on the subject of renewable energy. How long before alternative energy can replace traditional sources like petroleum? It's already happening. The related question, maybe Max or Mark, you might know, what percentage of use of energy use is already renewable today in the world? My impression is it's like organic food, which is still kind of hovering around 10%. It needs to become much more. There's an interesting trend, which is that in developing countries, the adoption of renewables is much, much faster than the developed ones. There's a lot of reasons for that. The word leapfrog, infrastructure is not there. It's easier just to build the right thing from the get-go than to try to build the infrastructure first. It's so much more cost-effective right now to build alternative. They call it alternative. I don't think of it as the alternative anymore. It's the preferable energy. Okay. And in terms of, I don't know, here's my behavior. When somebody contacts my company looking to finance something other than renewable energy, I politely say, keep it in the ground. Just leave it in the ground. I don't want it, whatever you want to mine, extract, etc. Yeah, I'm not interested. That's how I express my right livelihood in this world. I just say no to deals that I think are improper. And then they got to go find somebody else who will probably charge them more money than we would. An interesting fact about that, I'll end my rant in 15 seconds, I promise. That recovered carbon black, it's elemental carbon from tires or plastics. You can make recovered carbon black from old tires, and you put it in a loop, make new tires with the old tire material. And the reason Michelin North America recently committed to doing that, within 5 years, 100% of their recovered carbon, or carbon black, will no longer be, they call it furnace or fossil, is because the price of carbon black, the fossil, old school stuff, is going up. Why? Because they're tightening the environmental regulations. It's becoming more expensive to make it, therefore more expensive to buy it. And the recovered stuff is becoming very inexpensive by comparison. And they're the same, effectively the same product, just without all that nasty new petroleum being used. I should pay deference to my father, who was a petroleum geophysicist. It probably explains I didn't fall too far from that tree, and every time I'd complain about it, my father would say, well, I put you through college. Well, I'm out of college, okay? We didn't. All right. Once we're telling little bits of our personal story. And here's one for you, Mark. Why don't I hear more about low energy demand bicycling instead of high energy demand electric vehicles? This questioner, Jack, are you here?
Yeah.
Okay. Jack asked, he says, the CARB, the California Air Resources Board report, says they're doing well on decarbonizing the electric energy grid, rather, but they're failing on transportation emissions, which is still growing. So why don't we hear more about bicycles and other kind of low energy demand? Why all this fuss about EVs?
Well, definitely transportation, since we've already taken the carbon out of the residential and the commercial built environment, transportation is the big sector that we're looking at in terms of moving projects and programs. So whether that's electrifying the bus fleets that are public transit or the school buses, we're looking at partnering with other agencies to be able to do this on a bigger scale. I mentioned the ability for the other CCAs around the state to get together to bond out this sort of legacy costs. Well, there's other conversations about being able to get together and perhaps having larger scale projects in terms of electrifying the transportation sector. So instead of our little county throwing $5 million at a project, you could get together with the other CCAs and come up with $100 million to have a bigger impact, scale things up a bit. So this is so I'm not sure I understand the question in terms of all of the attention being moved to the transportation sector, because that's clearly the focus. We've got a intention to move into much more infrastructure for the EV charging, as mentioned. And in terms of that, we could bring back zero interest bike loan programs for electric bikes. That was a program that the county piloted many years ago. It was very successful, and then the money went away. So that's something that we could put into a revolving bank account and keep going, particularly for folks that live in close proximity to where they work or don't have the money, to buy vehicles.
E-bikes, e-motorcycles, pretty
So
efficient.
I will say that in terms of the built environment, Monterey Bay Community Power is going to eliminate 920,000 metric tons of carbon every year just by how we're buying our renewable energy. And in terms of what we're buying, yes, we're buying and sourcing off the Western grid as shown before, but in the first 6 months, we've purchased almost 500 megawatts of renewable energy plus storage, and this has been in partnership with Silicon Valley Clean Energy. So another unique thing, we partnered with an adjacent CCE to go out to the market and say, we want renewable energy and we want storage. And in that sense, we're incentivizing the market to go build what it is that we as customers want to bring in to our energy content portfolio. So this is huge. No CCA has procured that much renewable energy within the first 6 months of operation. 200 megawatts are coming out of New Mexico. This helps balance our portfolio a little bit because as things die down, renewable energy in California, it's still happening in New Mexico. It's going to be a direct conduit into California being built just for us for this particular project. And then we've got 2 other projects, about 300 megawatts plus about 90 megawatts of storage in Kern County, and these are 15, 20-year term contracts. On the local level, we also went out to bid for operations on about 20 megawatts of small-scale solar and hopefully storage. We'll see what comes back. Those bids, I think, just closed last week. And the idea was to get this 1.5 to 3 megawatts sprinkled around the Tri-County area at a price that is hopefully competitive with what we can find on the wholesale market. And this is really the dynamic tension that we have as a community. How much do you want to take out of those net revenues, which are under attack, if you will, from the legislative and regulatory side, and pay more to do local versus put more into rebates for customers to keep rates low and buy off the Western grid? There's a dynamic tension there that we as a community are going to have to figure out. But the idea is to really deal with this interconnection issue that we have in the county, Tri-County area, where a lot of folks that are wanting to expand business operations, bring in new tax revenue, can't get connected to the grid. The grid's maxed out. So what can we do behind the meter? We could do small-scale solar, hopefully plus storage, 20 megawatts. So some of the things that we're working on.
Very good, Norman. Thanks. Back to the transportation question real quick. And bicycles versus EVs versus... is there a community planner or community architect designer in the room? One of the challenges... Oh, Marilyn, what a coincidence. Yes, we're friends and in business. Okay. One of the challenges is range. Our communities were designed to make sure we have to leave and go a great distance to get to our job. Unless we're self-employed, which is a good idea. I wish I could ride a bike to work. Unfortunately, I have to go from my bedroom to my office, so I get no bicycle involved. But to your point, why don't we know or hear more about the low energy demand bicycles is a practical matter for range for a lot of folks. We need to redesign some of our communities so that the commute isn't so far. And then, of course, my business partner rides his bicycle everywhere. You probably know him, Ryan Sarnataro. Okay, so is there something that we're not getting to in your question?
Well, from what you just mentioned, I would point out that the car has design sprawl for us, whereas bicycles designs compact, walkable communities.
There you go. It is a matter of design. Yeah, that's right. Curitiba in Brazil did a really good job of redesigning the flows, right? There's a good model that we're not taking advantage of. Okay.
I would add to that advocating for housing of all types is really key. Yeah. Really key. We're at a point now where if you want to be progressive, we need to build some things. So
there's an action step. And here's another action step. I'm going to switch gears here. Back to the subject of agriculture for a second. For starters, how many Monsanto shareholders are there in the room? How about Archer Daniel Midlands? Anybody? I'm asking the question for shareholder activism, not to beat you with an organic carrot.
If you want to share, you can vote.
There you go. That's right. Okay, and that was not a recommendation. And okay. What is being done to get big ag to adopt carbon sequestering technologies? What is being done to get Big Ag to adopt carbon sequestering technologies? What percent of Big Ag has adopted carbon sequestering practices?
Well, it's a hard question.
Okay, go ahead.
It's a hard question to answer because there's an organization called the Soil Health Institute. Soil health has become the thing. Soil carbon has become a thing. The rub is it's very hard to use most of the current big tools that these companies have and actually sequester carbon at a reasonable rate. So I don't know, if you go to the farm show in Tulare, Monsanto, now Bayer, has an entire pavilion on biological agricultural solutions. So they would say, if there were a Monsanto Bayer person in the room, they'd say, we are all about it. We are all over it. But I think one of the key things that we want to see a system built that we don't want to just see them go from selling you a poison to selling you a biological solution and still taking all of your money if you're a farmer. It would be better not to poison the world and take your money. But the best solution would be a solution that reduces the number of inputs and increases the profitability of the farmers.
Yes.
And that's the system that we're working toward. And they're going to work toward a biological, more organic system where they maintain their revenues and their profits.
Right.
So that's kind of the rub.
Right. Well done. Thank you. That's great. Okay, and Mark, you can decide whether you want to answer that. And this is our last question, and it's the same topic, and it's begun to multiply here. So before it further multiplies, it's about population, of course. Huge factor. Need to reduce it. What's the best approach? Well, I don't know. Wait long enough. Okay, that's not funny. Projections show a reduction in the rate of population growth, but the other question says, aren't we already too many? Please.
Be happy to talk about that. When I was a kid, I became very worried about population growth, and it was like, this is something we need to do something about. I read a very interesting book just a couple of weeks ago called Factfulness by Hans Rosling. And if any of you feel a little depressed once in a while about the way the world is going, I strongly recommend reading this book.
What's it called again?
Factfulness. Not a great name, but Factfulness. Hans Rosling was a public health guy. He died last year. He did some incredible TED Talks on this topic. And he looks at a bunch of statistics about health and wealth and longevity around the world and violence, and points out that, overall, on the average, there's been amazing progress on most of these things. But specifically on population, I thought I knew about this stuff, but I didn't. So he said that the UN now projects essentially a peak population. We're currently at 7 billion or so, as I think many of you might know. Projects a peak somewhere between 10 and 11 billion. Okay, so that is still a whole lot more people, but it's not the exponential growth that we've been seeing for the last 100 years. I think a lot of us think, well, it's exponential, it's going to go on increasing. Okay, we're at the part of the S curve, and it is an S curve like most things are if you get them far enough, and it's starting to level up. And I talked to a friend of mine who does this kind of work the other day, who says actually it's probably going to be more like 7 or 8 billion. And so, I'm not going to go into the details of why it is. I really recommend looking at this book. It's really easy to read and entertaining and uplifting in a kind of way.
Second word back, what?
Factfulness, one word. Rosling is Rosling. Here is the thing that he's pointing out, is that everybody in the world, including us here, as we have more money, and particularly as women become more educated, have fewer children, and particularly as infant mortality comes down, we have less children because we don't, I say we don't need our kids to look after us in old age, or we know if we just have 2 or 3, that'll be enough. And the thing that blew my mind is actually, it's not just here in the first world, it is happening around the world. And yes, there is still parts of the world in abject poverty, but that's actually a relatively small percentage. And even in Africa, the fertility rates are dropping. And in Asia, they have dropped. So that's the reason why, and this is all, it's not just about population, that's kind of one thing we care about, but it's education, health, wealth, these things go together. And just one other point, we in the US, our average carbon footprint is twice what it is in China, where they burn all that coal.
It's more than twice.
3 times. Thank you. And I'm not sure what the multiple is to the average in the world, but certainly the poor parts of the world, it's a factor of up to 10. So in the worst case, the world population might grow by a factor of 2, more likely, between 30 and 50%. But if everybody consumed generate carbon the same rate as that's a factor of 10. Okay, that's the problem. That is a much bigger problem than the population issue. And that's, I think one we talked about things that we can do about.
All the more reason to radically reduce emissions and get carbon in the ground.
Right. So I kind of think it's hard to say anything is like solved like population, but it's, there are more urgent things we should focus our attention on.
Okay, I have a final, that's it for questions. There was one, I think, that is lingering.
Let's see, returning a small amount of money does nothing to reduce emissions and not an incentive at all. Why not have the money go to efficiency and local renewable projects? So obviously not true. The CCA model wouldn't be moving at the accelerated speed that is if it wasn't the number one thing that cities and counties can do to meet their greenhouse gas reduction mandates, AB 32, et cetera. So we are putting money into a variety of things, including energy efficiency, and we're looking at partnering with other social entrepreneurships that are accessing public good funds from the utilities to help accelerate that.
Beautiful. One quick go around, if you would each take a second, think about it. This is unconventional. Tell us what we should do. What do you want us to do? Take action. What is your recommendation? Please.
First. What I would like everybody to do is to think about the fact that we, the citizens of this county, this state, and this country, own a lot of land, individually and collectively. And I think we need to learn how the carbon and the water cycles work, make sure that the land you influence is managed in a way that makes those cycles healthy, and encourage your elected representatives to think about land management in that same way. And just one statistic, there is as much Roundup, glyphosate, sprayed for landscaping as there is for agriculture in the United States. It's even.
Wow.
So.
That's chilling.
Well, let's see. There are many things, but I kind of focus on this vote that's happening in November. It's kind of important. It's probably not, there's not much we can do here because, our representatives are already on the right side. But organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby and others are working for people that are interested, canvassing in parts of this state and parts of this country.
You're saying go to Fresno.
Exactly. Yeah. Where there's really the potential of making a big difference. So that's kind of one thing I think would be interesting to do.
Thank you. Mark?
I would definitely hope that people are going to show up and participate. This Community Advisory Council, this was a big deal. A lot of CCEs have formed community advisory councils. Sometimes they go well. Sometimes they become a hindrance to the local Joint Powers Authority. I think we've got a good group, but it really is incumbent upon the community showing up and helping these folks that have volunteered their time, very astute group of people that I think represent the very broad geographic and demographic area that we have in our Tri-County area to move the whole model forward as quickly as we can in our area. And I'd also encourage people to clue into the breakthrough technology and energy that is moving at a breakneck pace and get educated about it and advocate for that too.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. And what will each of you do tomorrow morning? Tomorrow is Monday.
Grass-fed
what will
beef.
you do in the morning? Spread some of that grass-fed butter on if you're not vegan, sorry. And for vegans, you'll find the alternative, and I'm sure it'll be just as sustainable. Or not. Okay. Thank you, everyone. That was, appreciate your attention.